Hi everybody, good afternoon. We've not done one of these though for a couple of months now, but we thought it would be great to bring a group of experts in to talk about let's say mould. I know we've used the Game of Thrones tagline here in terms of let's say winter is coming, but I don't expect a red wedding at the end of this. And, and, and in terms of ending this chat. So what I'd like to do is like to introduce our guests. So Harry, would you like to start? Just tell us a little bit about yourself,
Yep.
who you are and what you do, and
Yep.
then and come back to you.
Yep, that's fine. My name's Harry Olaito. I work for the HomeSafe scheme, or abbreviated to HomeSafe, and we're a delivery partner working with councils who have put in place selective licensing or additional licensing schemes for the regulation of the private rented sector in areas of their borough.
Okay, thanks.
I've previously worked for Leeds City Council and Doncaster Metropolitan Council as well as a landlord liaison officer and a tenancy relations officer.
Okay, great. Dave, do you want to go next?
Yep, I'm David Ingham, as building surveyor based at Ripon, North Yorkshire. Worked in and around North Yorkshire for about 40 years in construction. I'm now a certified surveyor in remedial treatments, specialising in damp and condensation, usually in older properties and usually domestic properties. But I'm also now a retrofit assessor involved making older properties more energy efficient.
Okay, thanks. Do you want to go next? It's Kenny.
Yeah, I am Kenny from Invicta Construction Finishers. We are cork spray applicators. We're helping families, councils, social housing companies get rid of black spot mould. We're also past 2030 accredited. We help with general insulation throughout the homes. We started predominantly as a plastering company, but obviously we've evolved over years. We find this side of the sector really interesting, and it's something that we want to really help people with.
Okay. Last but not least, and it wasn't because I'm not a feminist or anything, but we've just gone through the process of house building and stuff. Jeanette, do you want to just say who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I'm Jeanette Hamill from Hamill Decorating Services. We operate in the Edinburgh and the Lothians area up in Scotland. And for the last couple of years, we've actually been working with Indiacoat, who are a Dutch company who specialise in antimicrobial coatings, and in particular, working with an anti-mold product. All
right, thanks, Jeanette. The main reason we've done it like this is actually because we wanted to kind of work through the process. So in a minute, I'm going to get Harry to talk about his role in terms of housing law and legal aspects in the policy, and then we'll go on to Dave, who'll talk about the damp proofing and the surveying, and then on to Kenny, and then lastly on to Jeanette again to talk about the page. So we can provide you with an answer to the problem you have. Jeanette and I attended an event, like I say, yesterday, which was the kind of Scottish, like I say, lettings day up in Edinburgh, and every landlord and letting agent that came through the door had the same problem. How do we get kind of rid of mould? 90% of the problems were down to the living styles of the individual, but how do we actually do our bit to try and actually prevent the mould in the first place, so that we take away that avenue of uncertainty as to who's responsible for the mould. So, Harry, let's come back to you. Let's look at the legal aspect of it and the responsibilities.
Okay.
Want to talk generally about that?
Yeah. Well, firstly, and I'll try not to zip around in all sorts of directions, because there's so much legislation that applies to housing that it can be mind-blowing for someone like a private landlord or even local authority officers. But I'll give a couple of quick anecdotes first with regard to our own experience at HomeSafe inspecting properties on behalf of local authorities. In one case, it was a terraced house, brick built post 1919. And one of the photographs, internal photographs, showed a circular hole in on the outside wall of one of the bedrooms. It was about, I'd say, almost a foot across and circular and precise. So it had obviously been carried out by someone who knew what they were doing, not just somebody with a sledgehammer. It looked as if an extractor fan had been there. And so that went straight out onto the street. Now, bearing in mind our inspection of that property was done in winter, so it was bitterly cold. So I looked at the other internal photographs, and it was a child's bedroom. There was a bunk bed there and some children's toys, but not much else around. It had been escalated up to me, and I got in touch with the landlord, who couldn't get it into his head. He said it was there when he bought the house and it was the tenant's problem. And the only way, before dismissing it, or rather sending it to the local authority for enforcement, I tried to get through to him why it was necessary for him to sort that problem out. And I used the example of his own children. What if one of his own children had to sleep in that bedroom or try and do homework in bedroom? They just wouldn't be able to do it. And that finally got through to him the seriousness of the problem. At the other extreme, was a semi-detached property. 5 people in occupation, 2 parents and 3 children, plus several dogs, several cats, several pet rats, 3 tropical fish tanks, and birds in cages. So the amount of moisture that that number of mammals, although the birds and the rats wouldn't have put out that much, but that puts out a lot of moisture, the human beings, the dogs, and the tropical fish tanks. So there was a serious mould problem amongst all the other problems with the property. But the landlord was engaged with the property. The tenant paid their rent on time, but contractors that the landlord attempted to get to deal with the mould problem and other issues refused to return to the property. So I got in touch with the council, and eventually it found out that social services were aware of the family there, and so they got involved and worked alongside the landlord. So where a landlord doesn't know what to do, partly it's about seeing what council services may already be involved. If you look at the situation the family are in, you can take a guess that there might be involvement from somebody like social services. But social services, unless they're already involved, you can't just make a report to them and someone from social services will necessarily turn on up on the doorstep. They have to be invited in. Some councils will have well-being officers in particular areas, so it won't be necessarily social services with formal involvement. There'll be a well-being area for people with problems, whether that's fuel poverty or whether that's health issues or whether that's disrepair issues in the house. And so if you've got that sort of contact, they can be very helpful for both landlords and tenants. So anecdotes over and done with, you can sort of glean the policy direction of travel with regard to damp and mould and property conditions by, I suppose, the most recent enactment. This is social housing, not private rented housing. And it's the Social Housing Regulation Act 2023, which comes into force next year. And the little boy who sadly died in not Rotherham,
Rochdale, wasn't it?
Rochdale, that's it, yeah. Awabishak. So after the coroner's report, what's called Awab's law has been inserted into that Social Housing Regulation Act, and it makes damp and mould a higher priority for local authorities to deal with. The government did a consultation, I think, in 2022, and it turns out that for Category 1 hazards, so there's the health and safety hazard rating system, which looks at hazards in properties. And Category 1 is the highest or the worst level, the most dangerous, meaning imminent risk of death or serious injury. And serious damp and mould comes within that. And there were in 2022 between 40 and 80,000 socially rented properties with Category 1 hazards that include damp and mould. And I think 120,000 properties with Category 2 level damp and mould.
I mean, do you mind if I just ask you, Harry? Because that's quite an interesting point. Because if I'm a landlord, and I'm not addressing this, well, what can happen to me?
If you're a social landlord and it gets to the ombudsman can fine you and make a finding of maladministration. Now, one of the things is if you look at, say, so I often go to, for information, the local government lawyer webpage. And when you go to that webpage, it's day after day, there are maladministration findings. A lot to do with London housing providers, especially housing associations. And I don't want to name names, people can go to, but there's one that comes up in my mind most, it's very regularly comes up. They inherited a lot of housing from local authorities in London. I think they have 125,000 properties. And, you know, week after week, you see their name come up and it's a £5,000 fine, a £12,000 fine, another 5,000. And that's just building up. So you can see how local authorities want to be on top of this with their own properties, because you can't, local authorities are stretched enough and you can't be facing those sorts of fines on almost a daily basis.
So as a private landlord, what's the sort of things that can, you know, because I'm on a number of property, like say, groups, and I see people trying to say, well, I've had enough now, I want to sell my portfolio. You know, that's because probably the government are making it harder. But if I'm a private, like say, landlord, is there any comeback on me, or is it down to the tenant to take their own action?
It depends on what the situation is. So if you're a private landlord on a Acacia Avenue in High Hills, whatever the postcode is, it's only if a tenant or a neighbour, say, makes a complaint. So if a neighbour makes a complaint about antisocial behaviour coming from your property, or if the tenant complains that you haven't done anything about repairs that need doing to the property, then the council can have a legal duty, to go in. So they have to. But if the tenant doesn't complain, that duty isn't triggered. The council can't just walk into a house unless from the outside it looks as if it's, you know, about to fall down practically. In which case they can look at getting a warrant of entry. But otherwise, I'll just quickly cover this. In licensing areas, the council has a power to go in. So if a council brings in licensing of properties, they can just go in. They'll say, we're going into the property at this time on this day, and they'll carry out an inspection, and then they'll take action informally at first. But if the private landlord doesn't respond to what they do, it can lead to eventually a prosecution and a fine or imprisonment.
I'm not going to get
£30,000. So it's becoming important for landlords because the fines are so high, and some of the fines can be per offence. So if you've got 5 issues, you can be fined up to £5,000 for each issue.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that. Thanks, Harry. What I'm going to say to the audience is, if anybody's got any issues you want to raise, any kind of questions you want to ask, just drop them in the chat, and we'll pick them up as we go through. Hand over to Dave now. Dave, we're talking about damp and kind of whatever. So, what's the sort of things you come across in your daily life when you're out inspecting and surveying?
Well, usually when we get called in, there is some form of damp problem. A lot of our stuff is private owner occupied, but on tenanted properties, we occasionally get called in by the tenant, but usually because we need paying, it's by an agent or a landlord. And they can be saying, well, we've got a problem tenant rather than a problem property. So we're asked to go in and determine what the problem is. And it can be a combination. So we start with the damp surveying. Slightly different. I'm wearing a slightly different hat, I suppose, nowadays with the retrofit assessment, where we're looking at more the insulation and improving the energy efficiency of properties. But from the damp proofing point of view, I start a survey looking at the basic maintenance of a property. If there's a hole in the roof, there's not a lot of point in putting insulation in somewhere. You've got to start with the obvious things: leaking gutters, poor quality glazing, damaged pointing, areas where there's water ingress coming in. And we go on from there, and then we test for whether it actually has any damp problems that we could treat with, try and differentiate from rising damp, penetrating damp, and condensation problems. We're looking to offer treatments for rising damp, but then also looking at the insulation and trying to see if that has been causing a problem with some cold surfaces. In winter, we're very much looking at the relative humidity in properties, which can be more of a tenant created. They're the ones in there breathing and cooking and everything. And in older properties, if the surface temperatures on the walls are cold, this can be leading to condensation and to mould. So we'll be looking to suggest improvements on insulation, very much looking at ventilation, and more in the last year, we're looking at the heat recovery type ventilation systems, which are much more compatible with the retrofit and improving the insulation. Whereas before, to cure damp, you're saying put holes in walls, put some ventilation in, open the windows, make the place freezing. Tenants can't afford to lose that amount of heat. So we've got to get the balance between conserving the heat but removing the moisture. So heat recovery ventilation, some of the systems are difficult to put into existing buildings, but there are single room systems that might be better than just a straightforward extractor, which would remove all the warm air as well as the damp. Biggest problems we see are in sort of student lettings, HMOs, I suppose. I don't see too many of those now in our area. But we have a role of sort of trying to educate the tenants and the landlords, and where we see that there are improvements required. As I've got older, I suppose I've made my reports a bit more forceful, and there's no point sort of pussyfooting about it. If there's a problem the landlord needs to address, I think they need to know about it and be told quite clearly. But likewise with tenants, I'm quite happy to spend half an hour and say, well, some of the problem, the moisture that they think is coming from outside is actually being created from inside. And it's been mentioned about, pets as well, and fish tanks are dreadful for the amount of moisture they're putting into the atmosphere. So really, yeah, basic maintenance, checking for water ingress, any rising damp. Once that's been addressed and ruled out, then a better balance of heating, ventilation, insulation is required to control internal moisture. Warm up the internal surfaces can make a big difference. You often find the damp forms on one area of a room, and it's always the coldest surface. Double glazing, much better than single glazing. Removing the moisture at source from kitchens, bathrooms with extractor fans, or ideally heat recovery fans. Improving the heating and try and conserve the heat. Look at making the heating more efficient, more controllable. Don't overheat some of the rooms you don't sort of need to. And say the heat recovery, the mechanical ventilation is good if it can be made affordable and installed.
Yeah. Okay, I know we've talked a few times, Dave, about you talked about going in and everybody thinks it's a damp issue, but actually it's an inhabitant issue, and it's a tenant issue where they're not doing the things you've just kind of listed there in terms of kind of airing the property. And like so making sure look after it. I think one of the things we saw yesterday, as Jeanette, was that 90% of the people walking through the door, the lettings agents and the landlords, were saying that that's the issue, but it's how can we protect the building in the first place so that it takes away that area of uncertainty, as Jeff Boycott would say in cricket terms.
Yeah.
So that,
quite often when there's a conflict with the tenant and landlord or agent, it's much better for everybody to try and resolve the problem, keep them in the property, keep them paying the rent. It's expensive for a landlord if they've got an empty property that's then got to be redecorated. So if we can find a way, and things like the anti-mold treatments are fantastic if you can get it through to the tenant that's been the cause of the problem. It's worth landlords, agents investing to keep decent people in decent properties.
absolutely.
Could I just come in there, guys? I mean, I think one of the things to keep in mind is that the new social housing law that I mentioned that comes into force next year, and this may sort of bleed into renters reform if that eventually gets passed into law, is that one of the things was that the body in Rochdale that owned the properties were dismissing it as the family's lifestyle. And that's expressly not allowed in this new law. And I can imagine that landlords won't be able to get away with saying that when the new laws come into force that affect them.
Yeah.
So just bear that in mind.
No, thanks, Harry. That's a really good point, and I think from the conversations yesterday, Jeanette, I think a lot of the landlords we spoke to would not have been aware of that, or certainly didn't come across in the conversations that I had.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think a lot of them wouldn't have been aware of that. There were one or two that did say they weren't allowed to say it was the tenant's lifestyle, and were quite frustrated because it was, they'd done everything else that they could and they couldn't get through. So finding the right products that can help ease that tension and help both sides, that's going to be the key, I think, to helping move forward with this.
Yeah, well, we'll keep the process going. We'll move on to Kenny. So, Kenny, obviously you come across a lot of damp and mould in your day-to-day working life. How do you sort of address that? What's the sort of things that you'll do?
So we've started implementing cork spray coatings for a local authority in North Yorkshire, and they had lots of issues with black spot mold in several rooms within a few of the properties that we've already done. We've just done a 4 house pilot scheme for them, and what we're sort of finding is that properties are poorly insulated, they're poorly ventilated, and the mold and the damp is just building up within the house, and it's got nowhere to release it to. So we generally go in and assess the properties. Just to give you a little bit of background on the cork, so cork is sprayed on between 4 and 6 mil thick. We can spray it onto pretty much any surface. It's crack resistant. It has fungal resistance. It will, if we spray a surface area, it will retain 30% more of that surface area's heat. So we're also, as well as curing the black spot mold, we're also insulating the properties as well. The cork will put a barrier between any damp plaster that mold spores love. So it cuts its food source effectively, therefore killing the mold spores off at the source. we then put a plaster or a decorative finish over the top of the cork, and it's ready to be redecorated. So that's basically what we do with the cork. So we will go into a property, we will assess it, we will look at, you know, is there water coming in from the outside? Are there other damp issues that need to be resolved first? Is that the issue, or is it a moisture content issue? Once we've established those, then we will go in, we will give them advice on some ventilation and things that they can do. We don't tell them that that's what they have to do. We just offer it as guidance, if you like. So then we will go in. Generally, we will spray the external walls, because they're generally the coldest walls, and that's generally where most of the black spot mold will build up. Bathrooms and kitchens, we tend to fully spray throughout, so we will spray the walls, we will spray the ceilings, and get them all prepared and ready. The other beauty about using cork as an insulator is you get very few cold spotting, so we can spray right into the window reveals. We can take socket boxes off, tape them up, and we can spray right behind all the socket boxes, which is something that you don't get with other forms of insulation, because obviously you've got to refit that box or that socket back to it. It's also a lot easier for properties that are lived in. The cork and plaster finish is roughly about 8 mil thick, so you're not adding 40, 50, 60, 70 mil of insulation to these properties and then trying to refit a kitchen or refit a bathroom suite into it, and you've reduced that size of the room down. So cork obviously has many benefits in those terms. So with an overview, that's roughly what happens, and that's roughly what we do.
Okay. So I mean, do you find that, you know, because obviously, do you find you have to go back and check, or do you find that once you've put the application on, that should be enough and that should do the job?
Yeah, we've actually done quite a few now. So we will do the plastering work, leave the fans for drying out the plaster, and then we will revisit the property in a few days once it's fully dried out. We will then do another revisit in a week or two and just make sure there are no issues and give it a complete sign off. But I mean, we recently did an apartment where the external had actually been rendered with an EWI rendering system. So they put a 90 mil EPS board on the external and rendered it, which is quite a common way of insulating properties, I'm sure Dave will tell you. But what it was actually doing, because it wasn't very well ventilated and because the insulation was so harsh on the outside, the moisture within inside the apartment was absolutely horrendous. As soon as you opened the door, it was like getting hit with a brick wall. You could instantly feel it. Yeah. And all the way up the staircases and all over the wallpaper was just absolutely covered in black spot mold, which was just the moisture trapped inside the building. It couldn't escape. So we went in, obviously stripped all the wallpaper out, cleaned all the areas for the mold down, advised them on some ventilation, which the councils took on board, and then we cork sprayed it out from the inside. Now the cork spray just helped break that barrier of the moisture, and that property's been absolutely fine since install. So
yeah, right, okay, thanks, Kenny. Last but not least, this is Jeanette. So we've been through the surfaces, so we're now on to applying paint. So do you just want to talk a little bit about, I mean, the mold that you see and how you come across it and how you deal with it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we came across Indicoat paint about 2.5 years ago, and being decorators, we were more concerned about the aesthetic effects of black mold. And as we've worked with the Indicoat paint and we've come across more and more mold, and we've learned more about, you know, the health effects of mold, we've become more and more focused on the health side of things and the improving the conditions of the tenants or the homeowner, as opposed to just the aesthetics. And Indicoat has transformed the way we think about mold, and the way it's different. The reason it's different is it's the engineering behind the product. So we've used all the anti-mold bathroom kitchen paints that are on the market. We've used all of them, and we've seen mold coming back, you know, 12, 18 months sort of down the line. So far so good with Indicoat. We haven't seen any of the mold come back. We're 2.5 years in. So and the reason that is with the vast majority of paints that are on the market that say they kill mold or prevent mold, is that they've got the paint, that they've got their standard paint, and they pour in a biocide and mix it up, and away you go. And the problem with that is that as soon as the paint's applied to the surface, whether it's walls, whether it's ceilings, the biocide begins to leach into the air. So there becomes less and less product left in the paint. So it becomes less and less effective at actually killing the mold that hits the surface. And then the mold eventually is able to come back. With Indicoat, the paint has been engineered completely differently, and the active ingredients are bonded to the actual molecules of the paint, so they don't leach into the atmosphere. So if the paint's on the wall or the ceiling, the active ingredients are on the wall, the ceiling, and as you've got the mold spores floating around the air, as soon as they touch a surface that has been painted with Indicoat, then the active ingredients start to kill the mold, and they prevent the mold from reproducing, and eventually you have mold-free surfaces. So it's a brilliant product. We've been quite skeptical, we've been quite quiet about it, and as we've built up experience, and the places we see the mold the most, obviously bathrooms is number one, bedrooms is number two, and we've had a huge amount of success in applying the product because of all the engineering that's been done in the background to actually manufacture the paint. The actual process itself was really, really simple for the painter to do. They go in on day one, they spray the product onto they spray the cleaning product onto the walls that have been affected or the ceiling, and they leave it 24 hours. And that 24 hours allows the product to kill the mold that is existing already. So you go in the next day and you can either wipe or sand it off. If you're a painter and decorator and you're applying paint, you would always be sanding your walls anyway as part of your preparation process. So once you've got the walls sanded, then you apply 2 coats of the product. It's really, really good. The painters, my painters love it, and my painters don't love anything, to be honest with you, but they actually love this product because it covers really, really well. It's got a really high level of titanium dioxide in it, and that's the difference. If you look at the Indicoat compared to other products, it's a lot thicker, it's got a lot more body, and it goes on. And if it's an individual, landlord that's going in to paint their tenant's property and they're doing it themselves, then they don't get covered in the product as well, because it's so thick, it's got a low splatter, so they don't walk out looking like they've just been part of some art installation or something like that. So it's really, really easy product to use, and should last 5 years. If the paint's on the wall, the anti-mold product's on the wall, and you keep killing the paint. So we've had huge success with it.
I think if I could just quickly add something to what Jeanette, David and Kenny have said, because it seems to me that the things you offer are all proactive rather than reactive, which I think is effectively why the event you were at yesterday was why you were sort of oversubscribed, is because that's the way it's going. I mentioned Awab's Law and the Social Housing Regulation Act and Renters Reform, which will bring in a decent home standard for private landlords. But there's already the, again, going back to the direction of travel of government policy, the Homes Fitness for Habitation Act 2018, which came into force in 2019. And if you look at the government guidance for that, that tells you where the government was going. And I can't see, if there's a change of government after the next election, that will change. And basically, it deals with the safety and the healthiness of the people occupying the property. And the government guidance basically says this act will make sure that irresponsible landlords improve their properties, and if you're doing this on social media or in an email, you do it in double caps. So it says, or leave the business. And it's those 4 words in that paragraph of guidance are the important thing as far as what the government is thinking. And bear in mind that I think the unhealthy homes are costing the NHS currently £1.4 billion a year, with people going to A&E and the NHS having to deal with people's poor lung health and various other illnesses. And I think the government and the NHS are working with lots of local authorities to try and work within areas so that it stops people coming into the NHS in the first place. So if they can deal with the housing, it stops the problem coming down the pipe towards the NHS and costing the NHS 1.4 billion. And damp and mould are up there in the top 5, I think, of the problems the housing problems that the NHS are dealing with. And currently, we work with as a delivery partner for a local authority in Norfolk, and that licensing scheme, selective licensing scheme, is coming to an end. Now, we've done 3 rounds of property inspections over the course of 5 years. We've just finished the 3rd. We haven't collated all the results yet because it's just finished. But in the 2nd round of inspections that started in 22, damp was the number 1 issue. Damp and mould was the number 1 issue that we came across. And out of 1,500 properties, roughly 4,000 issues, and 50% of the issues were category 1 hazards, including damp and mould. And so that tells you what the issues are. So it's important that I think landlords be proactive. If they want to stay as landlords, it's important that they be proactive rather than just reactive to, wash down the walls with bleach or put a coat of paint on it.
Okay, so we've actually got a question in the chat, which is great. Thanks, James, from James Erskine. So what would happen if, and I think this will be for you, Jeanette, what would happen if a tenant paints over, is that over the mould, James, or is that over the paint? If you want to unmute yourself, you can. Hang on. If you want to unmute yourself, James, you can ask it directly.
Yeah, sorry guys, I am driving here, so you'll have to apologise if there's a lot of background noise, but I am listening in. So I just wondered, I didn't hear exactly how that Indico system works there, but obviously feedback from social housing providers is that what happens if it's painted over? Does it lose its performance, or what actually happens in that scenario?
Yeah, it absolutely must not be painted over with something else. So the product works because the mould hits the Indicoat paint. The Indicoat paint has got the mould killing ingredients in the paint, and that kills the mould. If you put another coat of a different colour paint on you, they say, oh, I don't like that white or whatever, I want another colour, then that's it. It will stop working, because you've put the barrier between the active ingredients and the mould. You've essentially created a nice new warm moist bed for the mould to grow on, and that's it. It's going to stop. So the Indico absolutely has to be the top coat. And
the Indico also do a clear paint, don't they, just in case the tenant wants to use something else. So you can have the clear paint on top, but you can also tint it, can't you, Jeanette?
Yeah, so we can tint it to some of the paler colours. It's a very bright product, so we're never going to get a deep navy, like my background behind us just there. But if somebody really, really, really does want to have, that design element in the room, we can clean the mould off with the product, with the cleaner. We can apply the paint, and then we can put, there's a clear product that can be used. It's a wee bit shiny, so it might not suit everybody, but it's a satin finish, but there is that opportunity to do that as well.
Is that okay, James? Has that answered your question?
It does, yes. Thanks, guys.
No worries. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for your question. Is there any last points anybody wants to make, or before we draw a line under this and we move on?
Yeah, mine was a comment about the Indico. One of the things that sort of surprised and impressed me was that it could deal with a problem sort of by itself. Other paints that I've seen, you know, if there's still an issue with high humidity in the property, people not ventilating the place right, or even some water ingress, they will fail. But the Indico seems to be very, very confident that it will still kill the mold, regardless of the humidity.
Mhm.
That's all. I think
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree that there is a degree of flexibility in the Indicoat paint. So if there is a high level of moisture in the room or in the building, then it can cope with quite a lot. And it does seem to be a solution that can buy landlords time. You know, it can get rid of the mold and instantly improve the living conditions of the tenants. You know, they're not going to be made ill by the mold that's in the room. But if a bigger engineering solution is required to improve the overall building, it buys that time for the landlord to be able to either save up or B, wait in a long line for the tradesperson that they require to actually come and do the work, which is a big problem these days as well. So.
Okay. Anybody else want to make any more points? Like Kenny?
Yeah, I suppose just generally, I mean, the beauty about the cork is not only will it cure the damp, but it'll insulate the property as well.
Yeah.
It's a hyperallergenic, so it helps with asthma sufferers. You know, it's revolutionary for me, really, in the fact that we can go into a property and insulate it without taking the skirting boards off, whereas you can't do that with thermal insulated plasterboards and things like that, because you've got to strip the house out and start again. Whereas with the cork, if there's enough of a bridge on the top of the skirting board, we can literally just spray it straight on. We're not having to change windowsill boards. You know, we take the radiators off, we spray the wall, we put the radiators back on. We're not having to have them refitted. It's such an easy system to install and then replaster, ready for the tenants. You know, it's quite a game changer for us, really.
Brilliant. Anybody else want to add anything? Harry?
I don't think so. The only thing I'd say is that the private rented sector is extraordinarily diverse as an industry or a business sector. So you get all sorts of behaviours, not just by the tenants, but by various landlords, from the seriously criminal who are making a lot of money such that they can be fined up to a total of £300,000 in one case, to people who don't know what they're doing. But I think local authorities could do with looking at their landlord and tenant advice pages, because the majority of landlords, the local authority webpage on rented housing is not the first port of call certainly for a private landlord. So there's a lot of information I know that local authorities have on their websites, very crowded places. But I think it, in terms of rights and obligations, it could be, a lot of local authority websites could be more user friendly, because local authorities I think there was a study in 2022, and local authority web pages were 6th on the list of information and guidance sources, and tradespeople came first. And that's no insult to tradespeople. They've got a lot of important knowledge to give, but that says something about the way local authority information doesn't get across to landlords.
How about you, Jeanette? Got anything you want to add?
Only that, you know, if there's a mold problem, the solution doesn't have to be overly complicated, and it's you know. Yesterday, I think we were preaching to the converted. The folk that were there were really keen and, as Harry said, proactive. And there are solutions for them out there to help them look after their tenants.
Okay, thanks. The thing I like about this, basically, the thing I liked about this was that we're taking a kind of group approach to the problem. So you know, it's a kind of belt and braces approach to how we can address the mould issue from the survey to the plastering to the paint to whatever. And I think sometimes that's what councils and landlords and letting agents really need to think about, how we take a combined approach to it, rather than just trying to a one size doesn't always kind of fit all. I think what we have here is we have a kind of proper answer to the problem based on the brains trust we have in this room. So I'd like to thank you for your time. If anybody's watching this, thanks a lot. If you have any queries, we'll be posting this all on LinkedIn and Facebook and whatever. Please contact us directly. If you want to talk to some of the people, highlight them in the contact, and we'll pass those details on to them so you can have a chat with them and they can help you address your problems. Okay, guys, thanks a lot for your time. Really appreciate it. And this is the Construction Network. Like to sign off. Thanks a lot.